Okay, so Georgi has kindly already said what my name was. My name is Eva Toth, just to reiterate that. I'm a university lecturer, research lecturer and fellow at Oxford, where I run graduate courses in medieval Latin, Byzantine Greek and Byzantine epigraphy. And it is my pleasure to introduce today to you the book that I know well, and in fact written by the author whom I know well too. And I will, I'm sure, speak in Sean's name too, when I say that Petros, we're very, very grateful for this. It's a wonderful, obviously, scholarly event, but also an opportunity to kind of socialize in a safe but really much needed way. So thank you very much. And a further item that goes under the heading, it is my pleasure. I want to congratulate Sean birthday. Sean, happy birthday, and thank you very much for joining us today and actually really being generous at giving us a gift on your birthday of your presence and company. So our honorant, Sean, is an art historian. Maybe we could actually be a bit more precise and call him historian of Roman, late antique and medieval art and architecture. He did his undergraduate studies at Yale and then completed his master and doctorate at the University of Oxford. After that, he won several prestigious postdoctoral fellowships, just to name a few: the Getty Villa in Los Angeles, and then a Bard Graduate Center Fellowship. Thereafter, a residence fellowship of the Council of British Research in the Levant. Sean also held two posts. I mean, some of them actually for a short while, I think also simultaneously as assistant professor of art history at the University of Ohio and as the research associate of the project on monumental art of the Christian and early Islamic East at Oxford. Sean is now based at the University College, Dublin, where he's a lecturer, assistant professor, and at Astor Fellow at the School of Art History and Cultural Policy. Sean is a prolific scholar and dedicated teacher, and for further details, I have myself been really very thoroughly informed of his current and sort of future projects from his university website. So I would encourage you to consult that for further details. But let us today focus on what is important and what is actually meant to celebrate and discuss, and that is his first monograph, his opus magnum, Inscribing Faith in Late Antiquity, Between Reading and Seeing, published by Routledge in 2019. This book is loosely based on his doctoral thesis. And if I were to describe it in short, I would say that it examines visual functions of texts inscribed within Christian, Jewish, and early Islamic sacred buildings, that its geographical range is wide and spans the period between the 4th and the 8th centuries. So inevitably, there is a huge body of inscriptional material that it includes and studies. And the greatest part of his source material, in fact, comes from mosaic pavements in the Eastern Mediterranean. And some of this material also comes from the West, but it actually features a slightly broader range of artistic media, such as mosaic and painted inscriptions and carved texts, and in a different display context, namely walls. But much of this, as Sean will tell us later, it has to do with the accidents of survival too. So Sean's book focuses on monumental mosaic inscriptions that were placed in highly visible spaces. That is a very important element to this material, and were clearly meant to be read or engaged with on some level by different kinds of audiences, by their commissioners and members of clergy and congregation, visitors from local areas and far away. What does this study do? There is a great deal going on, and I will try to convey some of its complexity. But to begin with, it contextualizes this material. It studies inscriptions within their spatial and visual and religious and cultural contexts. It's really a major and a very, very important aspect of this book. It also discusses commonalities and differences between what is defined as Christian, Jewish, and Islamic inscriptional material. I found particularly insightful passages and parts of the book where he explores their relationship to both classical tradition, but really basically areas where they consciously disengage from the previous epigraphic culture and the religious traditions, mostly of the Greco-Roman world. And finally, most excitedly really, the book identifies a new function for inscriptions as they move into the interior of sacred buildings, creating a hybrid form of epigraphy addressing human and divine audiences alike, and shaping and reinforcing the communal character of sacred space. Sean, I've lifted that from your book, and I've just really liked how you in fact verbalized this aspect of your research. So the scope of the book, we've all understood that so far, is really, really extraordinary. And I'm assuming that one of the greatest challenges was covering a huge corpus of late antique inscriptions and really deciding how to manage and present this large body of evidence. And Sean solves this problem admirably, really. I mean, what he decides to do, and of course, all the while acknowledging that it is impossible for various reasons, some of which we might actually discuss later on, to fully cover this body of evidence. Instead, he focuses on themes that emerge from closely examining this material, and these themes actually form then chapters of his book. And they are, I'm going to list them and perhaps maybe stay with some of them, but very, very briefly, because I'm keen to actually ask Sean to take over and talk about his work himself. So some of these themes that Sean treats in detail are colors and materials, not only as they feature with material in situ, but also looking at how texts themselves describe their own materiality. Then Sean also focuses on the visual aspects of inscriptions. So there is one particular strand of his research that features in this book, but really also separately in individual publications, where he looks at framing devices, and particularly those that came or originally featured in a classical context, like cartouches, tabulae, and sartae. And then he actually really looks at how these were adapted for Jewish and Christian Muslim uses. Then a further theme that is treated very closely is the capacity of inscriptions to prompt responses from their readers and encourage reflection and other ritual activities. Then one of the foci has to do with shorter texts and labels. Also some longer and more specific texts, which include prayers and perhaps also representations of donors. And in some ways, these prayers actually reference actual prayers that took place in the sacred space, but also invite reiteration and performance. There is a great deal to recommend this book, and obviously by now it is clear that I like it very much. I'm just going to, in a minute, before passing on actually letting Sean talk about his own work, just tell you what it is that I really appreciate about the book. It is the range, in fact, not so much for its own sake, but really the management of this material, very thoroughly researched, clearly written, beautifully illustrated. It draws on an impressive amount of excellent scholarship, but it is also original and thought-provoking. And really what in my mind actually makes this book stand out is Sean's keen eye as an art historian, and he approaches his work really always using evidence of his primary material as his starting point. I will leave it at this. I have a few further observations which I'll probably pick up on later as we wait for people to engage directly with both Sean and hopefully myself as well. So I'm going to mute my mic now and ask Sean to take over from here.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Ida. And I'm sure that introduction was overly kind, but it's good to see you and everyone else this afternoon. And thank you also for the birthday wishes. Yes, it is my my birthday today. So I'm sure at least there will be a sort of Zoom celebration later. We're on lockdown here in Dublin, as I know many people are in the UK and around the world. So not much to do out in the world. So it's great to be here with you today. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can show just a few images that I think contextualize the project that Ida has so generously described thus far. So just one second. Okay. And can you see my screen? Great, okay. So, Ida has already sort of laid out the broad outlines and some of the stakes of the project, but I'll just talk a little bit more about kind of how I came to the material and maybe also a bit of the material itself. So my book, Inscribing Faith, which was based, again, pretty loosely on my Oxford DPhil thesis, looks at the complex visual and verbal role of words inscribed in buildings of worship in the late antique Mediterranean. Its impetus was a sense, at least when I started the project, that these inscriptions had fallen into a gap between fields. They often were not paid much attention by histories of art and architecture, and their visual and material dynamics were overlooked by epigraphers and historians who were focused more on their verbal content, especially on what they might say about patronage and donation. Now, thankfully, this situation has shifted, with much more attention being paid to the multifaceted dynamics of texts of all kinds. So I hope my book sort of still has a productive role to kind of play in this newly expanded ecosystem of work on the visual and material dynamics of texts. So the book takes late antique inscriptions, typically published in corpora, organized by region, and sometimes also divided by material or by register and genre, verse versus prose texts, often without pictures of these texts, and tries to put these inscriptions back onto their buildings. Its goals are multiple. In addition to reconceptualizing inscriptions, the book seeks to investigate how inscriptions from mostly Christian, but also some Jewish and Muslim spaces relate to each other and to their earlier Roman, pagan, or polytheist predecessors. In order to assess these relationships, the book examines what these inscriptions looked like, what they might have made people do through their words or through their visual features, actions like speak, pray, think, and move, and ultimately how a more rounded approach to the texts can transform our understanding of the buildings they appeared within. So ultimately, the project is not only interested in the texts for themselves, but also maybe what they can tell us more broadly about these buildings of worship. For the purposes of the project, as Ida has already said, I focused mainly on texts written in Mosaic, in Greek, in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also for comparison looked at Latin texts, a small range of texts in other languages like Hebrew, Syriac, Arabic, and other languages. The majority of these texts that the book covers are, let's say, dedications that survive from the relatively durable floor mosaics of buildings that testify to names of their donors, though often memorializing their acts of patronage, as well as performing other functions like conveying prayers to the divine. The research for this book started from the texts themselves and eventually developed a thematic focus, which became the 5 chapters that Ida has already laid out, but just to go over them briefly again, focused on colors and materials, this kind of jeweled style for which late antiquity and late antique art is so famous, the frames of texts, texts that perform descriptions of the buildings they're located in, abbreviated descriptions of the buildings they're located in, and perhaps invite more sincere or deep engagement. Texts within images, so sort of short label inscriptions for names of figures, as well as texts that have been called tituli, these kind of texts that are meant to be paired with visual representations, and then also prayer inscriptions that are embedded throughout parts of buildings. For my last few minutes, I don't want to overload you with too many images. There are plenty, I think, in the book, but I thought I would show you at least a couple, including the fantastic image that I decided to put on the cover, which is from a mosaic panel, which originally was part of the floor of the late 4th century synagogue at Apamea in Syria. Here, the inscription, which records Eupeithes and her family offering the pavement for their salvation, is framed by skittering rainbow zigzags that I think draw the eye to the text. So there's something about the visual components of a lot of these texts that not only draw the eye, but encourage engagement with them. Each chapter, including the introduction, starts with an abbreviated case study that sets out the major issues at stake in the chapter. And I wanted to do that to sort of make the book more accessible, present a world in miniature, if you will, at the beginning, and then expand out from that in the rest of the chapter. So for example, the introduction opens with this mosaic that's on one side of the screen from a mid-6th century church at Gerasa at Jerash in Jordan, now displayed on the walls of the Yale University Art Gallery. And briefly in translation, the text reads, "Indeed, each high priest brings very beautiful wonders to the people who inhabit this city and land, wherefore famous Anastasius, teaching faithful beliefs of God, built a house to the first of the apostles, Peter and Paul, for to them the Savior gave power, decorated with ornaments of silver and vividly colored stones." Hopefully it should be clear just looking at it that the text is not just about donation. Not only do its colorful frame and placement in the central nave of the church demand attention, and you can see on the other side of the screen a plan from the book derived from that great work by Michele Piccirillo on the mosaics of Jordan, where you can see where that mosaic panel originally appeared on the floor of the nave. So not only does its position and its color and its frame demand attention, it also, in terms of its words, verbally performs a description in miniature on the church, adorned with silver and multicolored stones. The text's emphasis on the city of Jerash and the land interacts with the cities depicted underneath. Those are the Egyptian cities of Alexandria and Memphis, perhaps prompting us to think more about what local might have meant to the people of Gerasa. Anastasius's text functions then as both word and image, and those two functions are intertwined. And that's part of sort of one of the main takeaways, I hope, of the book as a whole. In the book, I do attempt to get at, as Ida has already said, what made the visual and material aspects of late antique inscriptions so unique and different from their Roman forebears. Viewers were continuously confronted by words writ large in interiors, which largely was a novel arrangement brought about by the new ways that churches, synagogues, and later mosques functioned as spaces of interior communal worship, perhaps unlike pagan temple interiors. Inscriptions also could take on an embodied character in this period, particularly in Christian contexts, as Christians held that God and Christ as God was the Word incarnate, John 1:1. And then for the comparative material, also, of course, the later sacred status of the text of the Quran in the space of the mosque. In the period, also, I think there's interesting things going on with the ways that texts are being written. In late antiquity, the ancient understanding of drawing and writing, this idea that graphe could mean both to draw, to paint, to write, began to bear fruit in public texts, in texts written in publicly accessible spaces. And here you have two bits from the book that are meant to kind of support this idea of more textual experimentation in terms of writing. This commentary on Virgil by Servius the Grammarian, this late antique commentary that makes the point that the Greek word graphe can be used for writing and for drawing. And then a text that's not quite late antique maybe, but early 3rd century from the walls of one of the buildings at Dura Europos in Syria, where our strict kind of Roman capitals start to sprout leaves and different vegetal forms. So this textual experimentation that I think is part and parcel of the period of late antiquity. The book is most definitely not a catalog, as Ida has already said. I wanted to keep its vision broad, to explore the possibilities and the edges of the phenomena that I look at in the book, rather than focusing on a region, a medium, a language, or a type of inscription. Indeed, one of the things that I hope the book demonstrates is the occasional futility of modern epigraphic categories, as the inscriptions, whether in verse or prose, can simultaneously be dedications, prayers, statements of religious practice or belief, and of aesthetic value. Certain tendencies are visible, I think, across confessional boundaries, including a delight in the colors, materials, frames, and layouts of texts, features that are grounded in Roman traditions of writing and inscribing, but that develop and flourish in the late antique world. So here I'm just showing you how one of these framing devices that I talk about in the chapter on frames in the book sort of moves from buildings of different faiths or different communities. So from the Christian church at Jerash to the Beit Alpha synagogue, where you have donor inscriptions inscribed in these tabulae, and then finally into not a religious building, but one of these early Umayyad desert castles where an inscription of the Caliph Al-Walid II, while he's still a prince, also appears in one of these frames. Even though these inscriptions are fossilized responses preserved in mosaic, paint, or stone, the inscriptions invite us to remember that sacred spaces were loud, active ones, full of texts and images that could be read in different ways, but always connected to the architectural spaces in which they appear. Through their appearance as well as their words, texts in these buildings asked one, I think, to do things, to move, to speak, to look, to act, to think, and ask us to remember that people in synagogues, churches, and mosques were not meant to be passive receivers, but to be deeply engaged in their own performances of faith. So I'll stop there and I'll stop sharing my screen maybe. And yeah, look forward to questions and discussion.
Super.